Let's go.
Welcome to the Trusted Leader Show. I'm your host, David Horsager. Join me as I sit down with influential leaders from around the world to discuss why leaders and organizations fail, top tactics for high performance, and how you can become an even more trusted leader. Welcome to the Trusted Leader Show. It's David Horsager. I have a very close friend, a special guest. We've been in a mastermind group for several years. Welcome to the show, Jay Baer.
Fantastic to be here, my friend. I looked at the episode count, and it's nice to know that I think I am just barely one of the 50 leaders that you trust the most. I'm somewhere in the high. There's about 47 people that you trust more than me, and that's okay. You know a lot of people.
No, I wouldn't go that far, but you'd move up the food chain for sure. But yeah. Finally got your schedule opened up now that you sold your fifth company. So
that's right. I'm finally trustworthy enough to make the show. I appreciate that.
So everybody knows, Jay's a seventh generation entrepreneur. He's just very recently sold his fifth company. He's built, 5 multi-million-dollar companies. He's got 6 best-selling books. We're going to talk about one of those today that I'm especially interested in, though. I think everything back to Hug Your Haters, and you go back to, utility and all those. There's just great gold in each of them. But I want to touch on this Talk Triggers one. Also, he's worked with everything from advising and speaking at the United Nations, 3M, Oracle, Nike, and a host of others. He really is a genuine thought leader in digital communications and marketing and in just plain customer experience. So more than that, give us a quick little background on you, something we don't know to get us started.
Well, I started in politics. I was originally a political campaign consultant and used to do all of the direct mail for the late Senator John McCain, who was a fantastic boss and a great lion of the Senate. And so I started in direct mail and then got into a lot of other types of media. I worked for the government for about 20 minutes. I realized that was not my thing. I worked for waste management. And so I gave a lot of landfill tours. So if you want to do part of the show on how landfills are constructed, I could absolutely do that. I got involved in the internet at the very, very beginning, 1993. So I started in digital marketing at the very beginning. So early, Dave, that domain names were free. You could get whatever .com you wanted, and you wouldn't have to pay anything for it, because at that point, 93, like who would want to what would you do with a website? There was no such thing, really. It was so early, and this is 100% true. My partners and I sold the domain name Budweiser.com to Anheuser-Busch Brewing in 1993 for 50 cases of beer. That was our actual purchase price. Now, in my defense, I think I was 23 years old or 24 at that point. I was the oldest of the partners, and we didn't just give it away. We stipulated in the written contract that it had to be bottles, not cans, because you got to stay classy. So it was a long time ago. So I have literally seen firsthand the entire development of digital marketing since it was sort of at the drawing board phase to what it has become now, $1 trillion business or whatever it is. So it's been an interesting 30 years for sure.
Unbelievable. In those days, I went through college, all the way through college with never going on a website or using email.
Yeah, I had a typewriter in college.
Yeah, and the next year it was everywhere for me. Like next year,
it was like all that.
Yeah, and I moved to Arkansas. Where I was, at least it was a couple years later, but anyway, and I, by the way, just say that with a wink, because I love Arkansas and my board.
All your Arkansas listeners are like, wait a second.
Yeah, no,
Horsager, this is ridiculous.
They're some of the dearest friends I have in the world.
Check the reviews of the show next week. You'll be disappointed from the Arkansas crowd.
No. But it is interesting because even in the role I had and stuff, we just didn't. It was a few years later, and it blew up. And by the it was something else to see what happened. So that's fascinating. We're going to get into this. I'm going to start with some of the book stuff, just content that way. We're going to get personal, though, over time, because it's the Trusted Leader Show, and you're a leader to so many. But let's jump in. If people haven't seen it, people can see I earmark it, or dog ear it and everything else, Talk Triggers. the book by Jay Baer. And I just think this might be interesting to start because let's just hear just a glimpse of what it is. I want to talk about the 4 talk triggers for a moment. I just think this is relevant to everybody as they try to convince people, as they try to connect with people, as they try to really show trust to people. And we could actually talk about any of your books. Hug Your Haters, maybe another show we'll do that because that's all about trust, isn't it, in a way? But let's talk about this. Where'd this come from?
First of all, I should note that the book is co-authored by my good friend Daniel Lemon. His contributions to the book were significant, and the thought leadership behind it. Dave, the premise is this: we trust people more than we trust any leader or organization or government or media. We trust each other the most, and we always have, going all the way back to caveman days, where somebody said, "Well, which caveman sells the sharpest, arrowheads?" Like, well, Glog, he's the man, right? I mean, it's the recommendations from your peers are the ones that carry the most weight. And the fundamental premise of the book, and while it's really written for a business kind of company perspective, it applies to individuals and speakers and parents and spouses as well. The premise is that the best way to grow any business or any audience or trust is for your customers to do that growing for you. And I think we all know that to be true, right? Like, if you ask businesses, hey, how important is word of mouth to your business? They will all say important, all of them. Yet, and this part is the thing that makes this book so important, nobody has an actual strategy to do it. The actual data from John Jantz is that fewer than 1% of all businesses have an actual word of mouth strategy. Fewer than 1%. Yet you've got a strategy for everything else, right? You got a leadership strategy, a trust strategy. If you follow Dave, and you should, you've got a PR strategy, crisis strategy, hiring strategy, diversity strategy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, marketing strategy, of course, social media strategy. But the one thing you don't have a strategy for is perhaps the most important thing of all, which is why should people tell your story?
I think something really interesting that seems like almost a contradiction at first. We've got this guy, one of the most sought after thought leaders in the world on digital and marketing, and you hear so much, Shazam in those spaces. And here Jay Baer is saying it is all about word of mouth. That's as much as you've done in the space of digital. And by the way, you can use digital, but it's this whole piece of kind of what I loved about it is it got back to truth, to authenticity, to what are real people really saying. Not we did it, in our study, we found that continually, like, online reviews are tanking because people don't trust them, whereas what you hear from someone specifically that is that trust is going up immensely. And I think that's just, it's really interesting in this space, right?
Yeah, you're exactly right. There is more online word of mouth now than ever before because of social media, the prevalence of ratings and review sites, et cetera. So mathematically, the volume of online word of mouth is higher, especially in the pandemic, because there's just not as many occasions for offline word of mouth than there compared to pre-pandemic. However, the impact of offline word of mouth, somebody you actually know at your kid's soccer game or what have you, is higher because you have that existing relationship with the person who is passing the story along. And people ask me a lot, Dave, like, well, okay, I don't get this. If businesses know that word of mouth is important, how is it then that they don't have a strategy for it? Like, what? I mean, it's 2022 almost. Like, word of mouth's been around for thousands of years. How is it that people don't have a strategy? And here's why. Almost every business or leader makes the same mistake. And the mistake is believing that competency creates conversation. That if you run a good organization or you are trusted and you're good at execution, that naturally people will notice that and will talk about it. And that seems right on paper. It does. But it's not actually right in the real world, because that's not how human beings behave. Every person in the world, including you and me and everybody tuning in, is wired the same way. We are wired to discuss things that are different and ignore things that are expected. Let me tell you about this experience I had last night. It was perfectly adequate. Said nobody in history, right? If I went over here and flicked the switch and these lights went off in my office, I wouldn't be like, Dave, you won't believe what happened when I hit the switch, the lights went off. You know why? Because that's how lights work. And we all know that. So there isn't a story there. Word of mouth is just a story. And you being good at your job isn't a story, because that's what they expect, right? That's why it's really, really hard for restaurants, for example, to create word of mouth around food quality and sort of tastiness, unless it's just a beyond crazy. Because guess what? If you're buying a meal in a restaurant, you expect it to be good. That's the whole point, right? So you don't get conversational credit for doing exactly what customers expect you to do. And that's the mistake that everybody makes. They just focus on competency, which is important. Don't get me wrong. Competency keeps your customers, but competency doesn't create stories, because it's just like, yeah, of course they do that. Right. Sure.
Well, let's talk about that, because you name one in the book. I remember the Cheesecake Factory. Mm-hmm. They create a talk trigger. You talk about Hilton and the cookie that creates a talk trigger.
DoubleTree cookie. That's right. Huge one.
So let's do a workaround, just kind of roundabout here. First of all, those 4 talk triggers you name in the book, talk about them, and then we'll get back and forth on a couple examples, because I think it's really interesting. So those 4 R's.
If you want your customers to tell a story about you, and you do, you have to give them a story to tell. And that story is something that you do operationally. Okay, this is a really important premise. A talk trigger isn't actually marketing. It's operations. It provides huge marketing advantages, but it really is an operational choice that you make in your business, okay? To do something that customers do not expect that will cause conversations. So you talked about the chocolate chip cookie at DoubleTree hotels. They give out to every guest every time they check in. We studied that in the book. And
it's warm.
34 is warm, right? It's not just a pile of cookies under a glass dome. That's the key. They hand it to you warm. 34% of their customers have told a story about that cookie. They used to give out pre-pandemic 75,000 cookies a day, Dave. So do the math on that. 34% times 75,000 a day is 25,300 stories a day about a chocolate chip cookie. Now, companion question, when's the last time you saw a DoubleTree ad? Like, kind of never, because they advertise far less than any other hotel at that price point, because the cookie is the ad and the guests are the sales and marketing department. And that's when you know you have a word of mouth strategy that actually works. One of my favorite quotes in history is from Robert Stevens, who's the founder of Geek Squad, the services arm for Best Buy. A brilliant, brilliant man. Robert once said that advertising is a tax paid by the unremarkable. And there's a lot of truth to that, right? You know, yes, there's a time and a place for advertising, but it's also true that many of the best brands advertise the least because their customers do that job for them willingly through word of mouth. So it's an operational choice that you make. They've chosen to give everybody a warm chocolate chip cookie. Cheesecake Factory has chosen to have a 200-page long menu. They don't have to do that. They chose to do it. It creates conversation. Just go to Twitter and type in Cheesecake Factory plus menu. You'll lose a whole afternoon. It's hilarious. But not anything you come up with, not just like anything you dream up, will work as a talk trigger. To your point, there's 4 requirements, 4 R's that have to be true for your operational choice to be a talk trigger.
Hey, it's Ann with the Trust Edge team here. As you know, we are passionate about helping you and your team perform at your best. And that's why David wrote his new book, Trusted Leader. This true-to-life parable follows the story of a CEO who uncovers the root issue threatening his organization's success. And in the back half of the book, David provides a roadmap for even how to solve those root issues. Get Trusted Leader for your team, your organization, or even just for yourself at trustedleaderbook.com.
Let's talk about those. Yeah, I think it's interesting because you look at Cheesecake Factory, in which I love that story in the book. You kind of open with it, and it's just the talk trigger. All these people talk about this long, massive, menu. But you think about that from a cost standpoint as a leader, it's like, there's
it's also a scratch kitchen there, right? So everything is scratch.
I know, which is amazing high
like,
cost.
To make that, they have, just to put a little finer point on it for the audience, they make chicken more than 60 different ways.
Yeah.
60 in that restaurant. I can't, if you told me, hey, name all the ways to make chicken, I couldn't come up with 60. They make chicken 60 ways in a restaurant, right? So yeah, operationally, it's incredibly complex. And in fact, their founder says in the book, like, there's no way any restaurant will ever copy this because it's so hard and it's so operationally challenging. But that's why it's so powerful from a word of mouth standpoint. You can't believe it. You're like, well, what is going on here? They make all the foods. They make every dish ever made. It's like a compendium of chow.
I think it's interesting. You go through the list of what is so unique. Ed DeBevick's in Chicago where they're rude to you.
Right.
What does that happen? Or in our space, I'll just push back on the opposite. There's a little steakhouse known in just right next to where I went to college, Bethel University, and it's called Lindy's Steakhouse. And the steak is amazing, and it's not the little place isn't that great, nothing's that great, but in fact, nothing about it is remarkable. It's like you're having these amazing, very expensive steaks. Yeah. And yet you kind of have it's not white tableclothy feel at all. You have three choices. You have this size steak, or this size steak. That's it. You get with that a baked potato and a salad. Yeah. Welcome to our steakhouse. Lindy's Steakhouse, super successful, only on word of mouth. Yeah. For those that want to know, Lindy's Steakhouse in Arden Hills, Minnesota. But anyway, they made the word of mouth in kind of the opposite way. And so anyway. Yeah,
but what's interesting about that, it's talkable not because it is less, it's talkable because it's not what you expect from a steakhouse. Right. So differing expectations doesn't have to be better. It just has to be different. Right. So it doesn't have to be fancier, and that makes it talkable. It can be less fancy, and that's what makes it talkable. Right. So it's just about breaking the expected pattern, not necessarily better or worse. It just has to be unusual in some way. Another steakhouse example, there's a great steakhouse in Los Angeles at the top of the Intercontinental Hotel building there in downtown. They have a steak knife menu. It's a very fancy steak place. And you order your steak, and then they've got like a steak knife sommelier who comes to your table with a velvet-lined box and opens it up. And there's 11 different steak knives in there. You got your big, like Australian, like that's enough one. And then you got like a really fancy, like pearl-handled French one and everything in between, right? It's a steak knife menu. You get to pick, choose your weapon, which I think is awesome. That's awesome. An amazing talk trick. It's a great one.
Well, we're looking at a talk trigger too. And before we get totally into the R's, but those of you watching can see Jay in a plaid jacket. And, Jay is in the Speaker Hall of Fame and is an amazing speaker. And one of the interesting things everybody knows about, in fact, someone brought this up to me today when they heard we were having you on the show. And that is that if you hire Jay to speak, you go onto his website and you get to pick which plaid suit he wears for your event. You can match with your color of your logo or whatever. But it's talkable because meeting planners, speakers bureaus, and others talk about, oh, Jay, not just the guy in the plaid suit. Many people just see you as the guy in the plaid suit and your brilliance and all that. But that event planner shares with us, and I got to pick what he wore.
That's it. Yeah, thank you. And I tell you, we switched that a few years ago. So I always wore plaid suits on stage because I wanted people to be able to find me after I got off stage. And in conferences that we speak at, everybody's wearing a suit in many cases. And so no one can find who's the speaker. But if you're wearing a jacket and pants that nobody else has, it's easy for someone to come up to you later and be like, hey, I had a question I forgot to ask, or we'd love to have you come to our event, whatever. So I originally did it just for audience recognition after the speech. And that worked great. But then I realized, well, yeah, I want the audience to find me, but the audience isn't really my customer. The customer is the meeting planner. And it's not an experience for them other than looking at me. And so it worked. It was a differentiator, but not really a talk trigger. A talk trigger has to be an experience, not a bullet point. That's why DoubleTree has an oven in every hotel and hands you a warm cookie. Everybody listening probably has at some point in their life been at a hotel that has a basket of fruit either at the front desk or by the elevator. Okay. It's a waste of citrus from a marketing standpoint. Nobody has ever told a story about that. Nobody's ever said, and guess what? I was at the Radisson and they had apples by the elevator. Nobody has ever told that story. Why? It's so similar to the cookie idea, but the cookie is an experience. It's warm. You can smell it. They hand it to you. They look you in the eye when they give it to you. It's an experience. Whereas the apples are just a pile. And so I kind of had that realization that I was making that same mistake. Me just wearing a plaid suit on stage is just my version of a bowl of apples. Once I made a special website and then let meeting planners go and pick out from one of 14 different suits, now it's an experience for them. They're part of the gag, see? And then it becomes much more powerful, much more of a storytelling propellant for them. And the best way, and this sometimes happens, is when the meeting planner will pick out, say, 3 that they like the best, then they screenshot that and put it in the pre-event email, send it out to all the delegates and let them vote on which one I wear. That's the best case scenario, because then it's an experience for everybody, not just the meeting planner.
And I've heard you introduced, by the way, that's awesome because you bring everybody into it. But I've heard you introduced and we picked what he wore today. Okay, who can say that? So let's jump backwards for a second. So we have the framework, four R's, and I can name them because I know and talk about them, but I want you to do it. The 4 R's that actually make something a talk trigger. These are requirements.
Yep. 4 things that are required. First, it has to be remarkable. It has to be worthy of remark, a story worth telling. And this goes back to, it has to be different enough that people are like, oh, I can't believe these steaks are so good and all the chairs are broken, or whatever the circumstances are at Lindy's, right? It has to be outside the pattern. That's the first one, remarkable. Second one is it needs to be repeatable. And what I mean by this is, it's common that people will make a mistake when they're thinking through word of mouth and say, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do something special, and we're going to offer that special thing to our biggest customers or our newest customers or our longest standing customers. Makes sense. Airlines do it that way. But the problem is when you think about the point of word of mouth, which is to get everybody telling their story, if you only offer the talk trigger to a subset of your audience, you are by definition reducing the number of people who experience it, therefore the number of people who will tell the story. So the best talk triggers are the ones that everybody has a crack at. Everybody gets the same long menu at Cheesecake Factory. Everybody gets a cookie at Doubletree. Every event gets to pick out my suit, and on and on and on. So you want it to be repeatable, not a section of your audience, the whole audience. That's the second one. Third one is it needs to be reasonable. Another mistake people make a lot is they try to shock and awe customers into creating word of mouth. Perhaps the classic example, which isn't in the book, but I think it's illustrative, is the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes. Remember that, where you could buy magazine subscriptions and then somebody would win $10 million. The problem was, especially in those days, the prize was so outlandish that they actually had to spend probably more than $10 million on television advertising, showing them actually giving a big check to people for people to believe that somebody would actually win $10 million. They would have been much better off to give away $1 million, because then people would have said, yeah, that makes sense. And they wouldn't have had to buy ads to produce evidence that it existed. This happens in B2B a lot, right? You've been to so many conferences and events, Dave, where you've got like the trade show floor, right? And they've got all these contests, and you got some software company like, hey, put your business card in the fishbowl. And at the end of the show, one of you is going to win a Caribbean island. I'm like, wait, what? Wait a second. That can't be right. There's no way that's true. So the summary of this is that when you give somebody an experience that's too grand, it doesn't create conversation. It stops conversation because they don't necessarily believe it. And nobody wants to get involved in word of mouth and tell their friends something that might be bogus and untrue. So it has to be reasonable, right? A chocolate chip cookie, it's a darn good cookie, but it's just a cookie, right?
I was going to say there's a differentiator from an apple, just plain on taste there, by the way.
Yes. You don't need to overshoot it. So don't shock and awe. It doesn't actually work, backfires. And then the fourth thing is wherever possible, it should be relevant, right? It needs to tie back to your core value proposition or the elements of your brand that make you trusted. This isn't just about randomness, right? So it's not like, hey, we need word of mouth, so let's go rent an elephant and we'll put a blanket over it with our logo on it and we'll walk that elephant down Main Street. Like, yeah, you could do that, but the word of mouth won't be about your business. It'll be about the elephant because it's too weird. So the best talk triggers are the ones that make sense in the context of who you are and what you're about. And if I may, people ask me like, well, wait a second, DoubleTree hotels, they're not a bakery. Why do they give away chocolate chip cookies? Well, good question. I talked to their CMO at length for the book. They're a client as well. And turns out that all the hotels in the Hilton portfolio, there's like 22 brands, I think, that Hilton owns, right? You got the Conrad, the Hilton, the DoubleTree, the Hampton Inn, all of them. And they each are trying to shoot for like a different traveler. They don't want to go head to head because that's very inefficient corporately. Somebody's like luxury personal travel, some are mid-range business travel. You know how it works. They all have different audiences. Because of that, they all have different brand positions. DoubleTree's brand positioning, according to their chief marketing officer, very trusted leader, is the warm welcome. The warm welcome. DoubleTree wants to really dominate that, I don't know, whatever it is, 7-10 minutes between when you set foot on the property and when you set foot in your room. That gap of time, they want to be disproportionately good at that. So they put more time, money, effort into lobby design than most hotels at that price point, more time, money, effort in front desk clerk training than most people in that price point. And the cookie is a big part of that. Right? Because again, it's not just a pile of cookies. It's a warm cookie handed to you, hand-to-hand pass in a paper sleeve. Hand-to-hand pass is the brand standard. So think about it. Warm welcome, warm cookie. So it fits the brand standard, right? That's why I wore plaid suits before you get to pick out my plaid suit. It's part of my kind of stand-up comic sort of stage persona. It makes sense. So what you don't want is a talk trigger that's like, yeah, we sell cars, but our talk trigger is everybody gets free bubble gum. Like, I don't get it. It doesn't make sense. Right. So those are the 4.
I love it. So that is interesting. I think about this for our business. I don't know where you go with this, but we've thought about it a lot, and we've, for me, okay. So I'm, this trust thing is a big deal. We have a way of thinking about it, but it's like, okay, part of my thing is I'm not going to be stressed for them. Like, we're going to serve them so well, so we take care of all the details on the office side. But as far as a look, it's not going to be weird or not even unique, not even going to be plaid. It's going to be a dark, like not an odd suit, not a this, not a that. Any recommendations for people to think, they're kind of in this space where nothing about them is that odd, or not odd, but like sometimes would be repeatable?
Well, it doesn't have to be something in almost every case. The talk trigger isn't something that you already do. It's something that you decide to do, but it just fits philosophically into your overall vibe. There was a point at which DoubleTree didn't give out cookies a long time ago, but there's a point at which that did not happen. So it doesn't have to be something you're already doing. In fact, in almost every case, it's not. But this might be a good time to talk briefly about the 5 types of talk triggers.
Let's do it. I've got them outlined. I love it.
So we got the four requirements: remarkable, repeatable, reasonable, relevant. All 4 of those things must be true. Then you want a talk trigger that is at least one of these 5 things. Okay. Talkable speed means you're faster than your audience expects you to be. There's an accounting firm in Indianapolis called Bogdanoff and Dodges. Totally unremarkable. Small accounting firm, does the same thing every accounting firm does for the same price. Fine. Except they reply to every client via phone or email within 5 minutes at all times. 5-minute response time from an accounting firm. They've got like 80 Google reviews, which is crazy for an accounting firm. And they all mention how fast they are. It's outside your expected pattern. Like, whoa, super fast accounting firm. That's noteworthy. I'll tell that story for sure. So talkable speed is one. Talkable usefulness is one where you're just more useful than your audience expects you to be, more kind of helpful and this is typically rooted in information, sort of giving away free information, is how that one works. You have talkable attitude, which is when you're a little more sort of wacky or irreverent than what people might expect you to be. There's a great band that I talk about on stage in this one. They're a group of 7 session musicians from Nashville, incredibly accomplished jazz and blues players. But because they're session musicians, they're contracted to labels. They're not allowed to tour and perform. It's just part of their contract. They only have to work in the studio for other musicians. So they get around that by dressing up, wrapping themselves in mummy clothes. They literally are wrapped in mummy bandages. And then they travel the whole country in secret. Nobody knows, literally nobody knows who they are still. And the band is called Here Come the Mummies. So that's amazing, right? Like if you listen to their music, like, yeah, this is a great song. But if you watch them, you're like, oh, these guys are mummies? Like, okay, now I'm telling that story, right? So that's talkable attitude, which is one I really like.
Talkable empathy. Go ahead.
The one that happens the most often, right? Is when you give somebody more than they expect, right? So
you call that one talkable generosity.
That's right, talkable generosity, and so that's the one that is most common. So free chocolate chip cookie, talkable generosity. It's the one that you see most often in the wild because it's usually the one that's the easiest to operationalize. But it's not inherently better or more talkable. It's just the one that most people can think through how to do it easier. They expect this, we give them that thing plus this other thing, right? So generosity is the one that's most common, but by no means the best. And the last one, I think we're on 5, is yes, talkable empathy, where you're just more human than customers expect you to be, right? You just take better care of them. I was in for a surgery earlier this year, and 2 days later in the mail, I got a handwritten thank you note that was signed by the surgeon, the anesthesiologist, and 3 different flavors of nurses. Thanks very much for being here. I hope you feel better. This wasn't an elective surgery. This was like a surgery I had to have. And I'm like, well, wait a second. Shouldn't I be sending you a thank you note? I think we have this relationship upside down, but I really appreciated it. And I tell that story all the time because it was so unexpected. And that's just sort of treating a human being like a human being when it's time to do that. That one can be harder for bigger companies to do, although it worked for this hospital. It can be hard for bigger companies because sometimes some team members are more inherently empathetic than others. You can train for it, but it's sometimes harder for big companies.
Hey, it's Sam from the Trust Edge team. Most training and development initiatives don't last or even solve the root issue hindering your organization. That's where Trust Edge coaching certification comes in. Trust Edge coaches are equipped with a suite of tools to identify, benchmark, and close gaps in trust for good. Because when you solve the real issue, you get measurable results in a culture where people actually want to make an impact. So whether you're a coach with your own clients or a leader training people inside your organization, check out trustedgecoaching.com and see how you can start solving the root issue and get lasting results in your business. And now back to the show.
There's so much here, but before we get into a couple of personal questions, I just have to ask: how would you start? You got a team, you got a company. How would you start in the book? Just so everybody knows, everybody can see it that's watching. But it's Talk Triggers by Jay Baer and Daniel Levin, and you've got a whole process. And there's so many great ideas. But
6-step process.
But in the 6-step process, how would I take my team? I'm going to get my team together at the boardroom table.
Here's the worst thing you should do. The worst thing you should do is the thing that everybody does, unfortunately. Which is they get everybody in a conference room, they brainstorm it. If it was that easy, you'd already have one. It's not that easy. That's why you need a book. So the first thing you want to do is, and this is slightly different than how it works in the book, but the first thing you should do is map your customer journey. So what are all the touch points that you have with customers today? Website, phone, live event, email, invoice, reminder, invoice, whatever, right? So you map that whole thing out, customer journey map. And then you want to go interview some customers. When we do this professionally as a consulting firm, we often will interview 18 customers. Sometimes we'll do it as a survey. It's better as one-on-one phone calls, but you do what you can do. What you want to ideally do is interview 18 customers one-on-one, 6 new customers, 6 kind of customers that have been with you for a while, and ideally 6 lost or lapsed customers. And what you do is you talk through that customer journey. Hey, remember when you came to our website for the very first time? What reactions did you have? And what did you expect? And then you just shut up, right? You just let them talk. You want to have them kind of walk you through their reactions and their expectations for each of those key touch points and inflection points. Because remember, a talk trigger only works if it's something that the customer doesn't expect. And so to know what they don't expect, you first have to know what they do expect. And we often think that we know what our customers expect, but I've been doing this for a long time, and it's very common that we don't fully understand what customers expect. We're too close to it, right? You can't see the label of the jar that you're in. So it's much better off to let customers talk you through that. And then what you do is you say, okay, here's what they expected. We actually create an expectations map. And then you say, all right, the 3 most kind of important touch points are first phone call, send them the bill, and the conversation we have about renewals. I'm just making this up. All right, those are the 3 most important things. Here's what they expect for those. What could we do at each of those 3 touch points, or at one of those 3 touch points, that they wouldn't expect, right? How could we be empathetic? How could we be generous? How could we be useful? Whatever. And then you figure out how to operationalize that talk trigger. And then, really importantly, you test it. So what you want to do is say, okay, the talk trigger is going to be letting meeting planners pick out your suit. Well, then you don't do it for everybody. You do it for like every 4th person. And then you check how talkable it is. You ask them afterwards. Hey, did you tell a story about anything? What'd you mention? Oh, yeah, I talked about the suit then. Great, check. Right. And so what you're looking for is sort of a talkability threshold of about 15, 20%, right? If 15 or 20% of the people who experienced it in test talked about it, then you've got something, and then you roll it out to everybody and you're home free. But just sort of like, hey, here's a fun idea, let's put it into practice. Nah, there's more science to it than that, or there should be.
Great. Well, there is a whole lot more on talk triggers in the book, and I just love the idea of genuine word of mouth, both offline especially, and of course that can become genuine online, which is a big deal today. So Talk Triggers by Jay Baer and Daniel Lemon. I don't always recommend books like this, or hold them up like this, or show how I've tabbed things over like this.
Well, that one's got alpacas on the cover.
This one's different.
The
and it has, if you're not
book.
watching, that's a talk trigger. Alpacas. Yeah. There you go. So I probably should have said I didn't dog eared. I alpaca eared it.
Alpaca eared it. Yes.
So,
yes.
Let's just touch briefly on a couple other things and get
Sure.
personal. We talk a lot about leading yourself well. You've been an advisor to so many others, from political to business to everything else. What are you doing to lead yourself well?
I think, especially in the pandemic times, a couple of things. One, just sort of steering my team, my organization through the beginning of that. And we actually, other than the speaking side of the business, which is down a little bit for obvious reasons, we actually grew the business during the pandemic from a consulting standpoint, which we're really proud of, and kept the whole team intact, and things are going great there. But personally, I think it's just continuing to re-examine what makes me happy and what makes other people happy about me. And maybe it's age, or maybe it's pandemic, but not being afraid to make changes where changes need to be made. I think especially successful leaders can fall into a pattern of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And you kind of get calcified in your beliefs and in your ways and in your systems, because look, it got me this far. And I certainly understand the attraction of that thinking, but it can also be dangerous when the world is changing as fast as the world is changing today. To rely on what has happened in the past is probably putting some blinders on that don't need to be there. So more than anything else, Dave, I think that's it for me. I'm really trying to keep my eyes open to doing everything differently if that's what it requires.
Is that part of, we're close friends, and you've had quite the changes in your life, if we can go there a little bit, and I've talked about this ahead of time. Yeah. You, in the last basically year, you've become empty nesters with your kids who are all off to college or beyond now. First job for the oldest. You've moved one of your places at least. You've sold your presumably last big business sale. Maybe, I don't know what's ahead for you.
Presumably, yeah.
You've had massive change and challenge in the midst of this, and you've been open about it in ways. How has that changed you as a leader? All these things and more.
I've always been pretty good at compartmentalizing things and sort of handling a lot of things at once. More so from an activity standpoint, less so from an emotional standpoint. So yeah, it's been a super weird year. I've lived 10 years in the last 10 months for sure, in a lot of ways. But, and I think all of us have at some level, because of the pandemic and our own circumstances. But I'll tell you what all of this has done, Dave, is, put a cap on my own ambitions, right? Somebody asked me the other day, what's your number one lesson from the pandemic? I said, look, I don't need to be everything to everybody every time. And I certainly spent a lot of my career trying to make that happen, trying to say yes to everybody and everything. And I realized that when you do that, you actually are robbing not only the people who you care about the most of time and attention and love, but nobody gets all of you at that point, right? And even as a leader, it's not great for your organization when everybody's just getting sort of partial attention or whatever you can squeeze in between meetings to help them or mentor them or what have you. So this sounds reductive and simple, but there is some wisdom, I think, to doing less but doing it better.
We have a new phrase around here, just about margin these days. Margin covers a multitude of sins. Like when you actually have time for someone to look at them, and as you know, drivers like you've been and I've been, it can be a challenge to create it and be it and live it. And kind of when we feel like, oh, but we're doing this work for the greater good, right? And pausing.
Right.
And I think certainly I'm grateful because you brought a lot of wisdom, not all the business and all wisdom that you have, but you've in the last couple of years and through this time brought a lot of wisdom just from balance and margin and leading well in the midst of challenge. And I'm grateful for that.
Thanks. I think it's easy to fall into the trap that activity is a success metric.
Right. Totally.
That the quote unquote busier you are, the better you're doing. And I don't know that correlation is as strong as we sometimes think it is.
Absolutely. And that's directly from a marketing guy that wants to see people busy so they can market them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Here's a funny, scary stat. Horsager just came out with a report that said that the number of marketing messages up 40% this year.
Wow.
40% in 1 year, which it's just, nobody's saying, you know what I wish would happen. I wish I could get 40% more marketing messages as a customer, right? So
exactly.
I've got a new keynote about that. This idea that customers are building a moat around their attention. So the talk's called the 3 drawbridges, how to get the drawbridges lowered and get access to your customers' attention, because we're all besieged at all times by messages and buy this and this is cheaper and this is on Netflix or whatever, and people are just like, you know what, unsubscribe, delete, ignore.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're building a moat, right? They're just like going into the tortoise shell, and you can't. I talk about in this talk, you can't siege a moated castle. Right. That's why there's a moat there. You can it's not going to work. But you can get invited in, right, with a drawbridge. And so there's this whole idea of how do you get invited in when nobody actually wants to talk to you. And there's a lot of trust lessons in that as well.
Absolutely. All right. We've got something for next time.
There you go.
Before we go to the last question, what a treat it's been. Jay, thanks for spending so much time. I know we said we're shortening up our podcast, and we just... I've
been there. I've done 500 episodes of my podcast. I know what it's like.
Oh, my goodness. Hey, tell us, where can we find out more about Jay or connect with you?
Super exciting. I've got a new newsletter called The Baer Facts. Comes out every 2 weeks. It combines customer experience lessons, a statistic you should know. Typically, there's a tequila review because I'm a tequila collector. There's a life hack and a bunch of other fun stuff. So if you go to thebaerfacts.com, B-A-E-R, thebaerfacts.com, you can subscribe. Would love your attention on that. And as I just alluded to, I also have a podcast. It's all about social media and big companies, which may or may not be your thing, but it's probably the thing of somebody you know. It's called Social Pros. Nearly 500 episodes weekly since January of 2012. Social Pros podcast.
Social Pros. So you can find all this, of course, in the show notes, and we'll get that all over the place. And we thank you, Jay, for being here. Hey, it's the Trusted Leader Show. Who is a leader you trust and why?
Who is a leader that I trust and why? I'll tell you what, it's actually ironic. I just wrote about this in my newsletter last week. I actually really trust Ed Bastian from Delta. Delta, like all airlines, have had a tough go of it operationally. Some of it is circumstantial. Some of it, I think, is mismanagement, but it is what it is. But I pick brands the same way I pick friends, not based on how they do when times are good, but how they do when times are bad. And I think that's the area where Delta really separates themselves, and Ed separates himself as a leader. The communication that he sent to frequent flyers, the true apologies that they have issued to their customers is such a contrast to how the rest of the airline industry has handled it. I wrote a whole piece about it for the newsletter. So especially because it's so top of mind for me, I'll say Ed Bastian from Delta.
I love it. I can't tell you how grateful I am that Delta is my hub airline here in Minneapolis at MSP, because they're just, people can find something wrong somewhere, but I'm telling you, overall, they're better, and it's absolutely, I'm grateful, and I love it.
Yeah, one of the many reasons you'll never move, right?
I'll never, exactly. 2 reasons on the flight front, right? Go 100 or 200 flights a year is like from Minneapolis, I can get anywhere in the country in 3 hours. Yep. So I don't have to have a time zone of people in New York that kill themselves going to LA. And number 2, Delta, the hub of Delta. So
yeah, there's only a few places you can live. You can live in Atlanta. You can live. You can live. Right. Salt Lake City could be a place you can move, but the list is pretty short. Yeah,
it is. Yeah. But so anyway, well, grateful for you, grateful for dropping all this wisdom, and mostly grateful for your friendship, and thinking about you as you keep on keeping on in this new phase of life in many ways.
Thanks,
and
buddy.
Everybody knows you're still speaking, and you're still out there active.
Oh, yeah, doing great.
And
doing great, feeling great.
Yep, that's awesome. So that's been the Trusted Leader Show. Until next time, stay trusted.